Olá a todos e todas. Estamos dando continuidade ao nosso ciclo internacional de conferências sobre a Palestina. Eu sou Felipe Paiva, o coordenador do Caliban, o Laboratório de Experiências Coloniais Comparadas da UF. Nosso convidado de hoje é Vijay Prashad, historiador por formação, com doutorado pela Universidade de Chicago. Atualmente é diretor executivo do Instituto Tricontinental de Pesquisa Social e editor da Leftward Books, além de membro sênior do Instituto Chongyang da Universidade de Renmin, na China. É autor de inúmeras obras, dentre as quais eu gostaria de destacar as seguintes: Uma História Popular do Terceiro Mundo e Balas de Washington, uma história da CIA, golpes de Estado e assassinatos. Ambas as obras traduzidas e publicadas no Brasil pela editora Expressão Popular. Atualmente, professor Prashad é membro do Conselho Consultivo da Campanha para o Boicote Acadêmico e Cultural ao Estado de Israel. Professor Prashad, it's an honor to have you with us today. Please feel free to start your speech. We are here to listen you. Thank you so much.
Well, first, listen, I'm sorry that we have to change from Portuguese to English. But, both Portuguese and English are different colonial languages. Yours, Portuguese from the Portuguese Empire, mine, English from the British Empire. But so be it. Today we're talking about Palestine, where what the International Court of Justice called a genocidal war prosecuted by the Israeli state against the Palestinian people continues. It's not even been blunted by the fact that the International Court of Justice called upon Israel to stop its attack on Rafah. Israel not only disregarded the International Court of Justice, but hammered a small settlement of refugees, killing, so far we don't know how many really, in the so-called tent massacre in a section of Rafah closer to the Mediterranean Sea, where people had gone having been told that it's a safe zone, and yet that's where the Israelis killed them. Another in a series of war crimes. That war continues, and that war has not ended. But this particular attack on the people of Palestine in Gaza, it raises broader questions. What is happening here? Why are the Israelis behaving in this way? If you talk about colonialism or settler colonialism, the direct interest that you have, if you raise these issues, the Israeli state has already said that these kind of concepts are by themselves anti-Semitic. It's worthwhile to actually go back in history to try to see the nature of this particular dispute between the Israelis and the Palestinians, to unpack some categories. So I thought, let's go back into this dispute to unpack 5 categories: anti-Semitism, colonialism, apartheid, occupation, and genocide. Let's go through these 5 categories. First, anti-Semitism. It's important to recognize that anti-Semitism is not something that originates in the Arab part of the world. It doesn't originate in Palestine, doesn't originate in Iraq, doesn't originate in Egypt. Anti-Semitism is a European phenomena. It begins in Europe and it continues to flourish in Europe. Anti-Semitism is not the gift of the Arabs to world civilization. It's the gift of the Europeans. Because after all, long before we even had the term anti-Semitism, we saw debates break out in Eastern Europe, in Germany, in Russia during the Tsarist Empire, debates about the loyalty of the Jewish population. In fact, in Germany, this was called a Judenfrage, the Jewish question. Serious German intellectuals, people of the elite, would frame the problem as, can a Jewish person be both Jewish and German? Which is an offensive question. It's an anti-Semitic question. That question led to the pogroms, the violence against Jews, right through the 19th century, which produces, of course, the Holocaust in the 1940s. The Holocaust is an outcome of European anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism per se is a European problem that Europe then tried to export to the rest of the world. What do I mean by export to the rest of the world? It's very interesting. In the 19th century, there was a debate about Jews living in Europe. And what did the main ruling class, places, what did they decide to do? The main ruling classes basically said that let's remove European Jews from Europe and send them somewhere else. In fact, interestingly, Zionism as a philosophy, as an ideology, Zionism is a product not of the emancipation of the Jewish people, but it's really a product of surrender to European anti-Semitism. What do I mean by Zionism is surrender? Because Zionism accepted what the anti-Semites were saying, which was leave Europe and go elsewhere. Find your emancipation outside Europe. Find your emancipation in Africa. Some Zionists suggested setting up a Jewish homeland in Africa. Find emancipation in Palestine. And so, increasing numbers of Jewish migrants fleeing European anti-Semitism go to Palestine. Now, after World War I, the Great War ended, really during the Great War, as the peace was being shaped, the British, who understood that they were going to take over Palestine from the Ottomans as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the British government said that Palestine can be for European Jews. In other words, rather than the emancipation of European Jews within Europe, they wanted to send the Jews to Palestine. And that's the Balfour Declaration of 1916. In fact, the Balfour Declaration is a form of Zionism, Balfour Declaration, form of Zionism, which are both a surrender to European anti-Semitism. In that sense, Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism because it suggests that Jews cannot live anywhere they want. They must go to a Jewish homeland. They are not welcome in Europe. In fact, right through the 1930s into the 40s, the various colonial powers encouraged the exit of Jews from Europe to Palestine. Now, interestingly, the Europeans were not paying the price for Jewish emancipation. It was the Palestinians who were paying the price in Palestine. And when the Palestinians began to rebel against what they saw as the colonization of their land, the arrival of these settlers from Europe, European settlers, then the Europeans started to say that the Palestinians are anti-Semitic. So very interesting transference of European anti-Semitism onto the Palestinians. So the first concept is anti-Semitism, and the argument I'm making is that in fact, anti-Semitism is a European problem, a European project, and anti-Semitism is transferred overseas rather than solve the problem of Jewish oppression. The Europeans wanted to send Jews abroad, and that came alongside Zionism, which rather than a philosophy of Jewish emancipation is in fact a philosophy of surrender to anti-Semitism. That's the first concept, anti-Semitism. Second concept, colonialism or settler colonialism. Now, it is a fact that regardless of a Jewish population in Palestine going back thousands of years, it's a fact that the large number of Jewish migrants who came to Palestine in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s did not have a connection to the year 1000. These were Europeans from Poland, from Ukraine, different parts of Russia. These were Europeans from Germany, from Austria, and so on, who came to Palestine. They came as colonialists. They initially bought land from the Palestinians who were undergoing some distress, and then they settled on that land. This is a form of settler colonialism. Second concept, colonialism, settler colonialism. Very hard to argue that this Jewish migration from Europe was not settler colonialism. And certainly the Nakba, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians and the taking of their land by Jewish citizens of the new State of Israel was a form of colonialism, and indeed settler colonialism. That's the second concept. Third concept is apartheid. In 1948, just when the State of Israel was created, two other important events took place. One important for the concept of apartheid, which is that the South African state in 1948 established itself as an apartheid state formally. Now, apartheid, meaning living apart, is very much the philosophy in 1948 being followed in the United States. It was called Jim Crow. Very much the philosophy followed in many parts of the world where enslavement of human beings had been the practice, including in countries like Brazil. But the second event of 1948 was the Convention on Genocide, and I'm going to come back to that. So in 1948, when the State of Israel is created, South Africa announces itself as an apartheid state. So what is the concept of apartheid? It's a pretty straightforward concept. It means that there is a section of the population, first-class citizens, who have all the rights and privileges to land, property, civic rights, and so on. And there's a second-class citizen that doesn't have access to land, property, doesn't have access to religious freedom, and so on. The moment you establish a legal framework in which there is a first-class citizen and a second-class citizen, the moment you establish that, moment you do that, you are living in an apartheid system. That's without question. Now, in Israel, 1948, they said initially it's going to be a secular state. They're going to follow the principle of secularism. There is no difference between different people. But it was also clear at the same time that the state began to see itself as a Jewish state. Lots of privileges were given to the Jewish citizens, including that Jews all over the world, for good reason, because of the Holocaust, have a right to return to Israel. But despite the fact that there was a UN resolution 194 that gave Palestinians, the 750,000 who had been expelled, right to return, despite that, there was no right to return. Palestinians couldn't come back to Israel, but Jews could. That's an apartheid system. There are hundreds of laws now in Israel that privilege people who are Jewish, not just Israeli citizens, but people who are Jewish. That means if you're Jewish anywhere in the world, and you're able to establish that, you get all kinds of benefits when you return or come to Israel, all kinds of benefits. So that itself, that giving a certain class of people, in this case, um, giving a certain religious community rights over other people who live in that territory, that is apartheid. That was established from 1948 onward. Now, three parts of historical Palestine: East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank, were not being controlled by the Israeli state in 1948. They were controlled by Jordan, by Egypt, the United Nations, and so on. As a consequence of the war in 1967, Israel seized East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. And by seizing these three territories, Israel became the occupying power of them, so that the United Nations calls these three territories the occupied Palestinian territory. There is an occupation of Palestinian land. This is not a moral judgment. This is a legal, factual judgment. There is an occupation. Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank are occupied by Israel. Israel has, therefore, obligations towards those whom it occupies. It has violated those obligations from 1967. For instance, building illegal settlements in the West Bank and before in Gaza and in East Jerusalem, this is illegal. International courts have considered this illegal. This is against the principle of occupation. And in 1994, when Israel signed an agreement with the Palestinians, that Oslo Accord of 1994 suggested that East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza would become part of a new Palestinian state. So this occupied territory would be handed over to Palestinian jurisdiction. Israel has not done that. Therefore, it occupies Palestinian land. This is not, again, this should be uncontroversial. The last concept, you see, I've been over anti-Semitism, colonialism and settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation. The last concept is genocide. Now, this is interesting. Genocide, the concept, is rooted in the UN Convention on Genocide. Israel signed that convention. That was passed in 1948 as a reaction to the Holocaust. Now, interesting. The Convention on Genocide doesn't just talk about genocidal behavior, genocidal actions. You can't just say, start bombing people and then we call it genocide. To call something genocide, you have to, as an analyst, as a lawyer, as a court, etc., government, you have to be able to prove that the person conducting the genocide has the intent to conduct genocide. In other words, genocide is not just an action. You have to show intent. You have to show that somebody means to do this. When the South African government put its complaint before the International Court of Justice, a whole section of their complaint detailed the language of high Israeli officials that we are going to do a second catastrophe, a second Nakba, a Gaza Nakba, Gaza catastrophe. We're going to take care of or kill the human savages. That's what they call Palestinians and so on. They were able to demonstrate the intent for genocide. That is why the International Court of Justice says there's plausible evidence of genocide. So the term genocide used to describe Israeli actions, it's not a choice, it's not a choice. It's not something that you choose to call. It's a legal imperative. You are legally obliged because International Court of Justice says there's plausible evidence of genocide. It's a legal issue. The South Africans proved it. And in fact, you can go back. You can go back. You'll find Yitzhak Rabin, who is now considered a man of peace. Yitzhak Rabin, during the first Intifada, 1989, 1991, he formulated a policy called breaking the bones, where he gave Israeli troops allowance to break the bones of any Palestinian who threw a stone. That means if I throw a stone, that is my action, and the Israeli response, authorized by the head of the military and by the cabinet, the government, the military was then allowed to go and catch you and break your bones. It's called breaking the bones. I mean, this is not exactly genocidal, breaking the bones, but it certainly leads to a mentality that then after October 7th says we're going to wipe you all out. The Gaza Nakba, the second Nakba, and so on. Okay, I've been over 5 categories: anti-Semitism, colonialism, settler colonialism, apartheid, occupation, and genocide. And in a sense, anybody interested in themes of colonialism, themes of colonial oppression, won't be surprised by my analysis on what is happening in Palestine. They will not be surprised by it. But of course, this is at some distance from the popular media. Whether this popular media is in Brazil or where I am, in Santiago, Chile, or it's, in the United States, in UK, Spain, France, whatever. That media is not fully able to wrap its head around some of these concepts. Maybe right now they say, yes, it's a plausibly genocidal war, but maybe they can't wrap their heads around the other concepts: occupation, apartheid, and so on. But as I say, the evidence suggests that these terms are appropriate. And I think the evidence suggests that the genuine anti-Semitism is not there in Palestine. It remains there in Europe. That's where the anti-Semitism remains a danger and a threat. Not anti-Semitism in Palestine, but in Europe itself, which is why the Europeans are so anxious about this concept. So there it is, Felipe. 5 concepts, quickly in 20 odd minutes, an analysis of how these 5 concepts are appropriate and how we should understand them in the context of this war.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you so much for your speech. Now the chat is open for questions from our audience. So we can take a question. Meanwhile, maybe I'm curious about your concept is about your concept of the Zionism as a kind of anti-Semitism. Maybe you can talk more about that. It's really an interesting point of view.
Yeah, so Zionism as a concept is identified with people like Theodor Herzl and others. Herzl wrote a book called The Judenstaat, the Jewish State. Very smart, very interesting people. Now, what they were responding to, and if one looks at the Jewish State, Herzl's book, what they were responding to is the high level of anti-Semitism in Europe. And you see, there are 2 ways you can deal with anti-Semitism or any form of oppression, particularly group-based oppression, racial oppression, and so on. It's 2 ways you can deal with it. One way is you can say, I'm going to fight it. If there's racism in Brazil, I'm going to fight this racism in Brazil. We're going to build a mass movement. We're going to seek different kinds of allies. If racism is rooted in the property structure, we're going to go after the property structure. That's how we're going to deal with it. Yeah. The other way is to say that forget it. We can't tolerate this. So if I'm an Afro descendant, descended from African communities, and racism is exhausting, I'm going to just leave. I'm going to go and live in Mozambique. We're going to go en masse. Tens of thousands of Afro Brazilians. We're going to move to Mozambique, and we're going to call that Africanism. That Africanism is not a coherent response to racism in Brazil. That would be for me a surrender. You've surrendered to racism. Yeah, you've surrendered to racism, and having surrendered to racism, or in the case of the Zionist movement, having surrendered to anti-Semitism, you are almost a product of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism has said you should get out of Europe, and you say we're going to start a movement which is let's get out of Europe movement. There's nothing that the racists or the anti-Semites didn't want you to do in the first place. They wanted you to leave. And in making a philosophical argument called Zionism, you basically surrendered to anti-Semitism. That's the argument I'm making. Yeah.
Right. If I understand clear, it's the first victim of Zionism is the Jewish identity. If you can view for this point. Now we have some questions from our audience. First, Juliana de Oliveira Veloso. The question is, thank you for the talk, Professor. I would like to ask a question about colonialism. Do you believe there is a fundamental difference between colonialism of our time and the colonialism of other times? What are the continuities and ruptures between the Palestinian case and the others' colonizations?
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, all colonialisms operate differently. There is no um, absolute mirror image. Colonialism is a broad concept. It means a denial of sovereignty, particularly political sovereignty, because colonialism is different from imperialism. Colonialism is the denial of political sovereignty of a people. Their entire world is catapulted into somebody else's destiny. So that when England colonized India, Indian destiny was defined by the English, not by Indians. That's the broadest understanding of colonialism. And in fact, that broad understanding of colonialism applied then, it applies now. It's the narrowing of a people's destiny, their ability to govern themselves, have sovereignty over their lives. Palestinians have no sovereignty over their lives. They can be picked up, thrown in a prison anytime. Their political institutions shut down anytime. So, in that sense, I don't see much difference over time at that general level of colonialism. Now, of course, there's a difference, because the colonialism against the Palestinians intensifies during the era of decolonization. So while India, Indonesia, Ghana, and so on are winning their freedom, Israel is now establishing a colonial entity in the Palestinian lands. So there's a timing problem here. In the same way, there's a timing problem with South Africa. They install apartheid in 48 at a time when, again, Indonesia, the same year, Indonesia won its freedom. So both South Africa and Israel have a timing problem. Their colonial experience, colonialism of a special type, takes place at a time when other colonialisms were ending. So in that sense, there's a difference. But otherwise, I don't see, in the broadest definition of colonialism, I don't see much difference.
Perfect. We have a question by Maria Francisca de Berg. Thank you for the conference. I admire profoundly your work. On the withdrawal, you and Chomsky talk about military Keynesianism. How do you think this concept help us understand this particular moment in the US founding of Israeli army, despite the economic crisis work people have been enduring in the US post-COVID?
Yeah, so I mean, this is interesting. I mean, the United States doesn't seem to be able to find the resources to rebuild its own infrastructure. You know, Mr. Biden, so-called Bidenomics, asked for a massive infrastructure and investment bill. The US Congress refused to fund it. On the other hand, the US Congress recently agreed to give $90 billion to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. But you see, firstly, a lot of this military spending is a subsidy to the arms industry. That this is tied aid. So I give aid to Ukraine not to buy weapons from the Czech Republic, but to buy weapons from the United States. So a lot of this military aid is basically a subsidy for the US weapons manufacturers. And, you know, the concept of military Keynesianism is a pretty straightforward concept. Every government has to sort out the problem of the business cycle. When there's a downturn in the economy, Keynes argued that a government has to do counter cyclical spending, spend at a time when there's a downturn. In most countries in the world, counter-cyclical spending happens to build infrastructure, welfare payments, and so on. In the US, there's such a fear of communism, such a fear. In fact, this is something shared with the Brazilian right wing. Such a fear of communism, they would prefer to spend their military Keynesian multiplier in the military rather than in healthcare or education or things like that. They prefer to do the counter cyclical spending on the military side. So, certainly, by giving Israel money to buy arms, and particularly buy arms from the US, there's a way in which this military Keynesianism operates even now as a kind of anti-communist, welfare spending, or anti-communist, anti-cyclical spending. So you're right. This is a very much appropriate concept for this war.
Perfect. We have a question by Isaías Monteiro Bittencourt Cassiano. Professor, thank you for the conference. My question is about China. Since China-Israel diplomatic relations were established, the link between the two countries has resulted in $1 billion investment in Tel Aviv. At the same time, Beijing holds diplomatic meetings with the Palestinian leaders and defends the creation of a sovereign and independent Palestinian state. What is China's true capacity to work to resolve this genocide?
It's a very, very important and good question. Firstly, most countries in the world, including Brazil, continue to trade with Israel. There's a lot of talk about recognizing Palestine, but not enough talk about slowing down relations with Israel. Brazil, I think even now, continues to even have a military, um, arms kind of thing and surveillance equipment from Israel and so on. I mean, Colombia, which is very much, and Chile, where I live, they've taken strong positions on the genocidal war, but they are going to practice war games with Israel this later next month, I think, in the RIMPAC military exercises held in the Pacific. Gustavo Petro's Colombia is going to participate, right now in RIMPAC. Israel will be there. So these countries have a pragmatic connections to Israel, which are very difficult to just break overnight. I mean, I would say let's try to break them, but I can understand why it's difficult. Now, the Chinese are in a position now where they are dealing with a lot of pressure coming on their northeastern and eastern flank. US government putting a lot of pressure through Taiwan, putting a lot of pressure up in Korea. The Chinese really don't want to, rock the boat, create any problems with the US. So they have been making very strong statements defending the Palestinians, saying there should be a ceasefire. They even put out a 12-point plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine. They've been involving themselves very much, but they are not they don't feel that they are in a position to frontally challenge the United States. They don't want to get into a big conflict. Now, is this right? Is this wrong? Is it socialist internationalism? I mean, all socialist countries have to also operate pragmatically. They have their own national interests as well. They have to deal with competing interests, national interests and socialist interests. And country like China has for a long time favored national interest over socialist interest. We'll see what happens. I mean, obviously one wants more, not just in Gaza but also in ending the blockade on Cuba. Why can't the Chinese build a power plant in Cuba? Why can't they do more? Well, because they are balancing their national interest and socialist internationalism, and for very long time they favored the national interest.
Perfect. Another question from Maria Luisa Barbosa. Professor Vijay, thank you for participating. My question is about the Palestinian communist movement, which has operated most significantly through Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Since its foundation, we know that in 1970s the Communist Front had on considerable relevance in the resistance force. But after the intense dismantling of this organization and consequently the rise of other parties that today lead the Palestinian resistance, the expression of the PFLP reduced greatly. The question, in the present context, do you think there is a chance of dispute for communism inside the resistance force? And how is this expressed?
Yeah, so it's really interesting that the question, I think, correctly identifies the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine's big era in the 1960s and 70s. Because Hamas is created in 1987, just before the Soviet Union collapses. And when the Soviet Union collapses, the principal backer of the left forces in Palestine also disappears. Hamas has backers from Turkey and Qatar and so on and continues to thrive. The Qataris basically pay for Hamas. Nobody was there to take care of the PFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Communist Party of Palestine, now called the Palestinian People's Party. None of them had any major backers like Hamas had. So that's one. Hamas had a lot of resources after 1987. Secondly, the Israelis went and targeted the left forces and threw all their leaders in jail before they went after Hamas. They opened the space for Hamas to become stronger. And that's an issue. Now, can the left groups come back? Very hard to say. I really don't want to exaggerate the situation. But, so many of the best leaders of the left are in jail. And leaders play a role. They play a very important role in thinking through the conjuncture and so on. Many of them have been in jail for decades. They're out of touch. When they come out of jail, they don't necessarily, understand what's been happening in the camps and so on. So this is a real problem for the Palestinian movement in general, the weakness of the left. But I must say, the PFLP, for instance, isn't disappeared. It still exists, still fighting. Whether it can translate that fight into major victories, well, that we'll have to wait and see.
Perfect. Professor Vijay, I have a question, and is in fact we have agreement about time, and this question, in fact, two questions. One of them is how, what's the solution of this contemporary colonial question? Two states or one state? If two states is the answer, um, this is not a victory of the colonial ideology. This is my question. How, what is your agenda in this case?
It's another very fine question, and it's obvious that you're all thinking about these issues. Firstly, when the Chinese or the Indians or others now say we should honor a two-state solution, they don't actually believe that a two-state solution is possible. What they are saying is that Israel should not be allowed to annex Gaza, shouldn't be allowed to annex East Jerusalem, shouldn't be able to allow to annex the West Bank. So they are also tactically trying to defend this territory that the Palestinians are supposed to have. Look, it's very clear that over the course of the last 40 years, the Israelis have done everything to undermine the two-state solution. So whether or not it's a good idea now is irrelevant. It's impossible because of the nature of the settlements, the nature of the access roads, the so-called facts on the ground don't favor a two-state solution. In fact, interestingly, the most humane outcome is a one-state solution where you build a Palestine, slash Israel, which is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and where people, center their logic around anti-corruption, economic growth, pro-democracy, and so on. You can't do that in a context where you're fighting a frontal battle on the question of land and so on, a one-state, two-state, territory-based battles. Can't deal with the other problems. If a one state could be created, it would certainly upend the ideology of Zionism, but it's not on the agenda right now.
Right, perfect. Professor Vijay, we have an agreement about time. And once again, thank you very much. Thank you so much for your presence in our seminar series. It's certainly the first conversation of many others. And not only that, but we still together against the colonialism in all forms, even in the form of the Zionism. So thank you so much, Vijay. If you prefer talk some words, please feel free for that.
Well, firstly, I want to congratulate you for the seminar series you're running. I think the name Caliban is very interesting and important. The play from Shakespeare and so on. But I also want to say that as intellectuals, and I stopped being a professor a long time ago, but as intellectuals, we are in a real fight to reclaim ways of knowing, epistemologies, methodologies, and so on. We are in a real fight. The reason I went over those 5 categories is that sometimes we feel like we're living in an upside down world where categories can come to mean anything. There's no precision. So I'm very glad to have been with you and to know that you have a seminar series like this. And in any way that I can support it, let me know.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you.
Yeah.
See you, my friend.
Bye.
Bye, bye.
Bye. Cheers.
Então, esse foi mais uma conferência do nosso ciclo de conferências sobre a Palestina, hoje com o professor Vijay Prashad. Nós teremos uma última fala com o professor Lorenzo Veracini no dia 12 de junho. Espero vocês lá, espero todos lá. Um grande abraço.